This is one of those passages that when I was in middle or high school, I would have made the beeline to the back of the church to make sure that I could talk to the pastor about it. Probably more like argue with the pastor about it. Because I have struggled with this scripture my whole life. Even some of the commentators I read this week suggested that maybe we just shouldn't preach this passage anymore. And that made sense to me. But it also made me think about Thomas Jefferson, who took the Bible and took out all the parts he didn't like or thought he didn't need or he didn't agree with or he didn't believe. And it made me think of when we read the Rob Bell book, What is the Bible?, that Marcus Gentry was so intrigued by the way that they read scripture in Jesus' time, that it was much more a discussion among everybody, that there was an expectation that rabbis would have different interpretations of different passages, or even just different verses, that they were meant to be lifelong discussions. I also know that we're disciples, and we love questions, and we love challenges, and we love figuring this stuff out together. So it felt necessary to figure out if we could find a way to ground ourselves in this passage, even if nobody comes out looking great in it, either Abraham or God. So we have to understand this passage, that this sacrifice system has been in place for a while, that Abraham would have been familiar with it, with these types of sacrifices, even child sacrifices. In a strange way, this unnatural thing had become a natural part of their culture. Even if people found it abhorrent, they had learned to accept it as this complicated, messy part of life and faith and religion. And the reason we know Abraham is familiar is because he doesn't ask for instructions or any kind of guidance. He already knows how to do it. He's familiar with this process. Up to this point, he's never encountered a God that doesn't ask this kind of sacrifice from their people. The struggle with the sacrifice system is it's a never-ending cycle. If your harvest was bad, your wife was barren, then you must sacrifice more. If your harvest was good and your children were healthy, you should sacrifice more. It was like living in a permanent test. I don't know if you've ever been in a relationship like that, where you don't know where you stand with people, because that's where it was. Like, is God okay? Are we cool? And if you don't know that in a relationship, that's exhausting. That's a very stressful way to live and to be in a relationship. As Rob Bell points out, ancient people believed that the gods were always angry with them. That's not relaxing. And at the start of this story, Yahweh seems to be like every other god. I don't like this. And it's okay for you not to like it either. Fortunately, Peter Enns, who's an Old Testament scholar, he wrote a book called The Bible Tells Me So, Why Defending Scripture Has Made It Unable for Us to Read It. And he says this, he said, I want to assure people of faith that they do not need to feel anxious, disloyal, unfaithful, dirty, scared, or outcast for engaging in these questions of the Bible, interrogating it, not liking some of it, exploring what it really says, and discerning like adult readers what we can learn from it in our own journey of faith. We respect the Bible most when we let it be what it is and learn from it rather than combing out the tangles to make it presentable. I can't get rid of the parts I don't like in this story, that God gives a test at all, that it's the worst test ever, asking Abraham to sacrifice his son, whom he loves, that Abraham seems willing, even getting the knife above his head, ready to strike, that God then praises Abraham for not withholding his beloved son. I disagree with all of this. It doesn't sound like the God of love that I encounter. Especially in the Gospels, it doesn't sound like the Good Shepherd who leaves the 99 behind to go find the one that is lost, or the father who throws a party for his prodigal son. It just doesn't seem to fit. And as Rachel Held Evans says, I would probably have failed this test. She says, I'd like to think that even if those demands thundered from the heavens in a voice that sounded like God's, I'd have sooner been struck dead than obeyed them. So that's my first pass at this scripture. Mostly disgust and my willingness to be a failure. But we shouldn't just take one pass at scripture, right? It's more complicated than that. Like everything else in faith and life and religion, there are often layers and levels in different ways of seeing. So let's take a closer look at 2 verses. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." In another verse later on, their slow walk up that mountain, when Isaac asks where the usual lamb might be, Abraham responds, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." Abraham has some faith that he expects to come home with his son. His belief that this God, this Elohim, was going to be different than all the other gods. In all of his other encounters, God had only provided. He had provided a promise about being a blessing. He had provided safety on their travels. God had provided sons and land to Abraham. God had provided Abraham a chance to break free from the land of his fathers, from the old ways, from the angry gods. And Abraham chose to take that path and followed, trying to find a new way. At the conference I went to last week with Mark, International Thomas Merton Conference, they had several speakers, and they had one that I got to hear who was fascinating. She's the first person, or one of the first people, to do primary research on the history of Black or African American nuns in America. So of course it revealed another gap in my knowledge of America, of religion, of Catholicism, and of African American women in our history. So it was fascinating. Because she talked about how early they came into America, about how predominantly their convents were in the South, and how they followed many of the traditions of their time, which was that African American women were regularly rejected from convents. They were not welcomed in, but some were, and they were able to build their own. And it was pretty common at the time that when women entered in, if they had a dowry at the time, they would, if their family had had slaves, they would bring them with them. So in some ways she made us kind of confront our racism within the church, within Catholicism, within our history as Americans. So that was interesting. But what was most interesting to me was she said, but not all convents did that. There was one that would not accept slaves when women entered into the convent. Some that did not, there was one that did not reject them. There were others that didn't reject them, and allowed them into their communities. They chose to say no to a seemingly familiar, common part of life, practices that they knew and had seen, of seeing human beings as less than human beings and acting on it. They chose to act a different way. One that was based in their morals, based in their faith, based on the same scriptures that we read today. This is meant to be a story about a God who provides. not one that demands sacrifices. This story is fundamentally about a God who doesn't participate in the systems of the day, the common practices, especially if they mean that children are somehow expendable or sacrificable. If they are immoral practices, if they're bringing death to the community rather than life and wholeness, if they're fragmenting it. God is trying to be differentiated from all the other gods at the time. God does test Abraham. I can't erase the verses I don't like, but I can keep asking questions, turning and looking at the story, or trying to see it in a different way. What would have happened if Abraham had refused God? Or even argued with God? He had argued with God at Sodom and Gomorrah. He had said, what about the value of 50 people? What if there were 10 righteous people in this town? Would you save it? What if he had simply asked more questions or clarified? My Greek professor, Dr. Larry Kant, said there are words in those early verses of chapter 22 that are strongly up for debate. Whether or not it can be translated to sacrifice, or simply the phrase go up, look up. What if Abraham had looked up sooner? What if the ram had been there all along? And Larry Kant knows more about language than I do. He wrote 1,000 pages about the word fish in the ancient world, and he can read 10 languages, so I trust him. What if Abraham misheard God? What if he was supposed to fail the test? Or did he fail it? What if the test was to see if he truly believed that God, our God, was different than all the other gods? Larry Kant also pointed out, Dr. Kant pointed out, that this is the last time God speaks directly to Abraham in all of scriptures. I find it interesting that God spoke directly to him at the beginning of the story, but sends an angel messenger at the end. We know that God has been used to justify all kinds of things. Wars, racism, sexism, that he promotes the prosperity gospel, ethnic cleansing, all other kinds of atrocities, some of which are grounded in Scripture. I don't think that necessarily means God affirms or encourages or supports any of those things. I think humanity has always wanted to prove that God was on our side. But throughout history, humanity's morals have changed. And because of that, we have acted differently. Even from the First Testament to the New, they argue with each other. The scriptures itself argues with each other. That's the whole purpose of the prophets. That's all they do, is argue about how people are interpreting it. Jesus spent all kinds of time reinterpreting the scriptures and challenging the ways that they were doing their temple practices that seemed very unfair and unbalanced, that they were using them to keep people out of the community, pointing out how they had modeled themselves after the Romans and the powerful, rather than the laws laid out by God. So are there tests we're supposed to fail in order to be faithful? It invites us to ask the question, what are some systems we have chosen to reject rather than comply with because of our faith, because of our morals, because of our conscience? On the other hand, what are the systems that we have just agreed to accept, even though we know they're wrong? Maybe think this week, we've had to spend a couple of days inside because the air quality has been so bad that it's not safe for anyone to be out in it for any time. And we're not surprised, because climate scientists have been telling us for decades that if we didn't make radical changes, if the larger systems in our society didn't make radically different choices, if they didn't drastically reduce our carbon emissions, that our planet would start to react with changes exactly like this. With extreme weather, with forest fires, with less clean air. There are consequences to not changing. Now, maybe some of you, I don't know, have fought for climate change for decades, and I'm very proud of you. But I haven't. I'm newer to this. It's just one more system, along with others that I've been learning more about over the last 10 years, that in some ways I've remained passively silent about. Because that was just the way the world is, or that's the way church is, or that's the way disciples are. But like those very early convents, I know that not all disciples have been that way. Not all churches have been that way. Not everyone in society has been that way. Because like those early convents rejecting racism and slavery, there are those that have rejected what was familiar if it was morally empty. And people have been doing it for hundreds of years. So the good news is the sacrifices that we make here and now are entirely our own choice, not demanded by God. The way we share our resources and our time and our gifts to God are entirely up to us. That is our freedom. We are choosing to share them in order to bring wholeness to a very fragmented world, full of broken systems, unfair, immoral systems. We also have the freedom to grow and to change, to develop and to mature, to see the broken systems around us and do better and bring more wholeness. The pastors at my home church would tell you I asked a lot of questions and I had a lot of strong opinions, neither of which have changed. And they patiently listened, for which I am still grateful. And they didn't always try to change my mind. But they did always try to help me find God's love in the midst of every passage, of every scripture. They always encouraged me to dig deeper, to keep looking and see if you can still find the God you do know, and the experience of the God you are familiar with, even in the stories that are hard, even in the stories that challenge us.